Military power and state survival, 1815 to 1840. Government and foreign policy was an aristocratic game in Europe until the modern age. Commoners rarely played a significant role in either government or the military until the 19th and 20th century. Military might met both the need for internal order and the protection from outside threats. Governments feared their people just as much as they feared their neighbors, because there was not a significant bond between king and subjects. Kings were often abusive and looked out for themselves. They considered the kingdom their own personal property, therefore exploitation, not as a caring, loving father according to their own propaganda. But the kings and queens also had to watch out for other kings and queens who were looking to take over, or a local elite looking to usurp the throne and take over. So military power impacted state survival because it provided internal order. States used the army against their own people. Firearms then fueled centralization. Firearms were expensive, and those states that were able to capitalize on the use of firearms and provide it to their soldiers had a greater ability both to defend against an internal as well as an external threat. Because weakness invites predators. Internal predators from someone inside the community, or an external predator coming to eat the weak. And so states had to find out or figure out how to navigate both threats at the same time. In terms of foreign policy, this means that they had to use diplomacy. And by the beginning of the 19th century, European states were trying to follow this metaphorical concept of a concert of Europe, that all the kings and queens would play nicely together and harmoniously as a concert band would, or an orchestra would, and that if any one of them went off on their own, it would create disharmony and disrupt the concert. And so the art of diplomacy developed in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries to try to maintain this working in concert, all the while trying to work to stab someone else in the back. In foreign policy, they meant that the military was used to maintain a balance of power. As long as both sides were equal, then there would be no war. But they had no problem imagining that if one side got stronger than the other, then it's the predators are going to eat the weak, that the strong eat the weak. And so firearms then become essential to this story, that states that mobilize and deploy firearms effectively in their armies can defend against both external and internal threats to the survival of their state. This was an aristocratic game, right? So they did not play by all of the rules that we would think of today. Right? So kings were very protective of their royal prerogative. They did not consult many people to find out what they should do. They did not consider what was best for their country. They considered what was best for themselves. They believed in a code of honor and shame, that honorable people, well respected by their community of peers, had a better chance of getting their way, versus shameful people who were disrespected by their peers were more likely to to invite harsh condemnation or even intervention by their peers. So honorable people tell the truth, honorable people are courageous, honorable people keep their word, shameful people lie, shameful people break their word, and shameful people run away from a fight. So it was important for kings to stand up for themselves, and the easiest way to stand up for yourself if you have a pretty good firearm. But those firearms sort of cut both ways, because it does provide an avenue for elite resistance. Kings aren't the only ones who can buy firearms. And so nobles, merchants, wealthy people, and even bandits tried to buy firearms and then use them against the state. And so this story of military power and state survival, the development of firearms, also increases the ability or disruptive power of resistance or insurgents movements. The big question is that, was that an elite-led movement, or was it a popular revolt? Traditionally, the story is told in terms of popular revolts, that the Greeks would rise up, or the French would rise up, or the English would rise up, as if a people, right, common people, were rising up. But in the 19th century, that popular revolt needed and was inspired by an elite resistance. So in this process of centralization, central governments had to be very careful not to upset local elites, because when they did, the local elites would then purchase, pay for, and inspire a popular revolt, right? And justify that resistance by appealing to the people, not to God. And so these things go hand in hand: elite resistance and popular revolt and firearms create a deadly mix for state survival. The Congress of Vienna knew this, recognized this, saw this at the end of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. They saw the power of popular mobilization. They saw the power of nationalism. They saw the power and disruptive force of elite resistance, French nobles resisting centralization of the French king, inspiring a popular revolt, overthrowing, and then Napoleon coming through and disrupting the entire state system of Europe. So the victorious powers at the Congress of Vienna had a very clear understanding that war is a revolutionary force, that war itself disrupts state systems. And anyone that starts a war has a difficult time controlling the intended consequences of that war, because the outcome is always going to be uncertain. So the main political players, right, this aristocratic game that was being played, the goal was always restoration and conservation. The goal was never to create or inspire a popular revolt. Those people, right, those common people, those nationalists, were all supposed to be kept at arm's length. And so the kings in Austria, the kings in Prussia, the kings in England, the kings in France, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, right? All of those kings sought to restore traditional society and conserve it as much as possible. But they had to do so in the face of elite local resistance who were always looking for ways to claw back local control from a centralized power. The concept of Europe then meant that for much of the first half of the 19th century, European kings interfered in the internal affairs of another country to either restore or conserve the existing state order. Because they were afraid after the 25 years of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars that they were going to unleash this mammoth wave of popular resistance. And they had a real good reason to do that, because more and more average Europeans had experience with firearms. In this aristocratic game, there was a need for more pawns, people that were expendable. And so kings no longer took the battlefield. Right? Kings didn't go into war. Nobles retreated farther and farther from the battlefield. Their goal was maneuver. In their place, then, were masses of commoners. And so this chart shows the changing nature or the changing size of European armies from 1710 to 1815 to 1860. And hopefully you can see quite clearly that the size of European armies increased dramatically. Because the number of men drafted into and mobilized for war increased dramatically. These men needed to be paid, they needed to be fed, they needed to have uniforms, they needed to be armed, and they needed to be inspired. The French Revolution was the first example of mass inspiration, because they faced a restoration army from the Austrians, the Prussians, the British, and the papacy. They faced a restoration army and they needed to defend their country. They had chopped off the head of their king. They had established a republic. The most successful general to understand how to mobilize that mass nationalism behind himself was Napoleon. And then Napoleon marched all over Europe. When other countries saw that, they weren't willing to use nationalism to mobilize their armies, but they did want to then adopt and adapt Napoleonic tactics, techniques, armaments, training, because they believed that was the key to state survival. And so the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars fundamentally changed the relationship between military power and state survival. We're going to start first with modernization, military modernization. We're going to move then to Ottoman decline, how the changing nature of the European state system put the Ottoman Empire in a bind, and then the attempts of the Ottoman Empire to reform itself and to survive, and why the other European monarchies, who for years had been fighting against Muslim rule, found it in their interest to try to prop up or help this Ottoman Empire survive, because they feared if it fell, it could trigger another Napoleonic type situation, which they all wanted to avoid. So we're looking at military might and the survival of states.